The first question I wanted to ask you was about your writing practice and your clinical practice. Um, so one way into the question would be to say that, essayists that you write about and seem to care about, people like Emerson and Nietzsche and Cavell, um, often give voice to a sort of productive uncertainty about who might be listening to them.
Mm.
As Cavell puts it, philosophy is essentially uncertain who it seems to interest at a given
Mm.
moment, similar to psychoanalysis.
Yeah,
Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra has a subtitle, A Book for Everyone and No One.
yeah,
And Books for Everyone and No One seem to me an apt subtitle for the kinds of books that you write,
yeah,
which you write
yeah.
in the plural, kind of regularly as a sort of contributor. It
Mm.
seems in your publications. It's not as though it's once every 10 years. It's almost every
Mm.
year, every couple of years, fairly regularly. It might be too much to say that you keep an essay writing calendar in the way that you keep a calendar with patients, but
Mm.
each book's appearance certainly alerts your readers to something that has not yet been said or hasn't been said quite in that way, as if there were a
Yeah,
conversation ongoing. So my first question is about the relationship between your clinical practice and the writing of these books, as you yourself attest to it. Seeing
yeah,
patients a
yeah.
few times a week and
I
writing.
mean, I think the first thing to say is that there clearly is a very powerful relationship between clinical work and writing, but it's indiscernible to me, if you see what I mean. What I'm not doing is, as we're reporting back from the front.
Yeah.
And also, because I believe that psychoanalysis is private, I believe really people should not write about their patients,
Yeah.
really, even in disguised form. Nor do I think people should speak in public about their patients at all. So for me, it is, as it were, as entirely private as it's capable of being. So that's the first principle, so to speak. The second one is that what I've found is my experience has been that I had no conscious ambition to be a writer. It wasn't part of my plan, so to speak. I wanted to be a child psychotherapist,
Mhm.
and I then became a child. That was my ambition, conscious ambition. And the writing, in a way, started almost inadvertently, in the sense that I was in supervision with Christopher Bolus. He told me that the Nouvelle Revue de Psychanalyse was had started a section at the end of the journal of just short pieces, 1,000 words, whatever. And he said, would I like to contribute to one? So I went home and I wrote a piece on tickling in about a quarter of an hour. And it was all there and it was thrilling.
Mhm.
And it was slightly amazing. I don't want to sound ingenuous about this, but it was slightly amazing. And then it just started. And it never stopped. And it never stopped partly because I loved doing it, and partly because there seemed to be a lot there, if you see what I mean. I don't think about it very much. I don't research. I read a lot, but I don't research what I'm going to write, and I don't consciously think about it. But when I sit down to write, it is as though it's all there. It's not automatic writing, but it's close to that. Um, and I was aware, obviously, having had a literary education, that obviously, I had lots of different heroes as writers, but one set of them were those 19th century essayists you mentioned, and also Hazlitt and Lamb and so on. And it was a form that really appealed to me. So when I started writing psychoanalytic essays, I wanted to write something akin to that form. And it's as though if you write about psychoanalysis, well, you've got an already arranged audience, which is psychoanalysts. But I always wanted really to write for people who are interested. And I didn't want it to be esoteric or in-house in that sense. So my project, insofar as there was a conscious one like that, was that people who were interested would read it. And I've always thought that psychoanalysis should be not any kind of esoteric in-group, that it should be something that's open, because after all, it is about the most ordinary things in the world. So it shouldn't be difficult to be interested in it. And I think that was my wish, that there be something like, the fantasy of a common reader. Anybody who was curious might read them.
Mhm. Mhm. Do you mind if I ask a kind of follow up on two things you
Mm.
said? First, your own experience of writing the tickling piece, and the way you seem to have a kind of facility with writing.
Mm.
And one difference between writing and speech, one possible difference would be that in in writing, at least in my experience as well, although I don't have this facility you have, but I do find that when I write, if I concentrate, I can say, I think, more clearly what's on my mind with less of a censor, so to speak, than
Yeah,
I have in
yeah,
conversation.
yeah,
So that there's something more liberating, more emancipatory in the practice of writing, whether or not it gets published or goes out into the world, just putting
yeah,
things down, even when you
yeah,
scribble notes to yourself. Something
yeah,
much more honest, let's say.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think that has a therapeutic dimension, or if you're in your experience, if it does at all, and what that might have to do with publishing it would be my second part of it.
Well, I think the experience I have in writing is of tremendous freedom. It's like you said, it is as though it's uncensored. I mean, it must be partly censored, and of course there are moments of hesitation. But broadly speaking, it's like tuning into a kind of fluency,
Mm,
and I find that. I don't know if I find it therapeutic. I certainly find it extremely enlivening and
mm,
exhilarating.
mhm,
Um, Tom Stoppard said in an interview, when I write a really good play, I don't think, gosh, how talented I am. I think how lucky I've been.
mm,
Well, without being unduly modest, I feel similarly in the sense of things seem to have come together. And obviously, I actually wrote it, but it came from something in me that wasn't conscious or calculated or apparently intentional.
mm,
Um, and so it's almost as though it's like finding out how one is thinking, because I don't experience myself as struggling to articulate something. I experience myself, I'm aware of when I've got it right, and that means it sounds right to me.
mhm, mhm,
Um, but it's that way around. It's almost, it appears to be a sort of aesthetic thing.
mm,
I mean, I don't write things that are deliberately misleading or whatever, but if things are interesting and I don't entirely understand them, I leave them in simply to find out what other people think. Because I think of it as very, without being grandiose about this, communal, in the sense of this is what I've written, and then it's over to you and
mhm,
whatever you happen to think.
mhm,
And I've always been interested in that bit. There's a very, you may know, it's a very interesting Paris Review interview with Harold Bloom, where Harold Bloom says, I write all these books and I go to my friends' houses and they never mark the bits that I think are good. And you could think, oh God, how awful. Or you could think, great, that proves there are other people in the world.
yeah, right, right.
So that's the kind of thing that appeals to me, that people will make use of what one writes in ways one hadn't predicted, but it did something, had an effect.
How then do you take up other people's response to your work, if you do? I mean, do you then reincorporate it into the next thing you write? Do you think of this as a kind of back and forth, or is it more message in a bottle?
I I'm not sure really. I think I'm really heartened when people I admire the writing or value it.
Mhm,
I don't think of myself in a debate with a set of interlocutors about what I'm doing,
mhm,
even though clearly this is a cultural conversation that I'm part of, as we all are. Um, but it's much more that way around. It's much more as though it goes on facilitating, as it were, what I'm doing.
mhm.
I don't think of myself consciously as arguing with anybody. Look, clearly there's lots of arguing in the essays.
Right. I think that's one of the most interesting things about what you write, to be honest, is that it's not positioning
Yeah.
vis-a-vis other,
Mm.
say, even within psychoanalysis. There's this slightest hint of that, but not much, not very polemic. What you write, not very polemical.
Yes, that's right. And I think consciously, I don't want to see myself trying to persuade anybody of anything,
Yeah.
but I do want to, as it were, provide things as interestingly as I can.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I really think that's one of the most interesting things about what you're doing is that it allows for different kinds of transformation. People can change their minds more freely, therefore, without
Yeah.
having to,
Yeah.
figure out what their commitments are.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, um, you said earlier that and I think this is also interesting about what you do, that you don't write about patients. Early on, you had smallest of vignettes, but the more it seems to me as your career has gone on, that's really disappeared.
Yeah.
Um, and so you don't write case studies, which are the literary genre I think, most frequently identified with psychoanalysis.
Mm.
And you don't even write much about, that I can detect, about disorders or illnesses, so-called.
Mm.
So you've
Mm.
written about symptoms in the broadest sense, titled
Yeah.
about symptoms or side effects. And instead you write about familiar English idioms like giving up or getting a second chance, but also about pleasure, kindness. And when you and I spoke in New York, I mentioned to you that it's as if you treat these as virtues, particularly kindness, kind of more explicitly has been a virtue, according to some.
Mm.
And way back in 1993, you wrote that new virtues are surprisingly rare. And so I wanted to ask you about um, the virtue of writing about virtue, so to speak, in the way that you
Yeah.
do. Um,
I mean, this is a good example of an effect. When you made that comment about virtue
mm,
to me, it really struck me. And I went back and reread McIntyre.
mm,
And I realized that is in fact what I'm interested in. I'm interested in, and again, I've reread the Nicomachean Ethics just to find out what a virtue is, if you see what I mean, and how it might organize oneself, as it might be an aspiration or an ambition or whatever.
Mm.
I think I really am interested in that. I didn't quite realize the sense in which I was until you said it. And I think that I'm interested really in psychoanalysis as moral education.
Yeah.
A,
Yeah.
a different, a new kind of moral education,
Kind.
but moral education.
Mhm.
So questions like can virtue be taught, and those old things that we grew up on, so to speak, in university, I think are still very, very compelling. And of course, they get redescribed in terms of child development or all those developmental theories, and indeed all the psychoanalytic theories. And that's why in the lecture I gave at the New School, I think that's what one of the things I was getting at was that all these psychoanalytic theorists, under the guise of providing us with descriptions of our lives, or our lives as good as they might be, are really actually offering us a picture of what they take to be a good life, of a kind of sovereign good that they're aiming at. And I think, as I said in the lecture, I think that's a great thing to do, to give an elaborate account of what one takes to be the good, as long as it's available for conversation and isn't taken to be an absolute. And the trouble with certainly the strong theorists that I grew up with and was trained on and in were extremely coercive in a way, which is why, of course, they ended up being schools. And the problem with the schools in psychoanalysis was, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere, is that there's tremendous inner superiority in the members. Like in any cult, it is as though they know the truth about psychoanalysis, which actually is the truth about life. And this seemed to me, in a way preposterous from quite early on that there could be experts on life.
Mm.
It didn't seem to me preposterous so that people could say really interesting things about life.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd like to, I mean, I'll come back to this question of expert, the difference between the expert and the one who says interesting things.
Mm, mm,
Um, but if you don't mind, let me stick with the virtue and good question. I mean, I
mm,
totally take your point that the idea that one can prescribe, so to speak, on a chalkboard, here's
mm,
what the good life looks like.
mm.
But in thinking about MacIntyre and Aristotle, for Aristotle, the words about the good had efficacy insofar as
Mm.
they express or are embedded in what MacIntyre thought of as a context of beliefs and habits
Yeah,
and thoughts and
yeah,
feelings. And that MacIntyre also thought, well, we're born into a culture that no longer has that context or can no longer provide it. And I wonder if you think, I mean, Jonathan Lear seems to sometimes
yeah,
think
yeah,
that psychoanalysis could be that context,
yeah,
something like that context. I mean, in
yeah.
his response to MacIntyre, is that something do you agree with Lear on that? I mean, not to position you, but I wonder if you think.
I don't think of there being, in any viable and realistic sense, a psychoanalytic community.
Mm.
Um, I, of course, when I went into psychoanalysis, for me, it was a great romance and a wonderful thing. I still think that, if you see what I mean. But it's not clear to me I mean, it was clear to me very quickly that psychoanalytic so-called communities are extremely rivalrous and envious and so on and so forth, probably like all groups. So I didn't make a world that I wanted to be in, but I did have a background belief that it might or that it could. And I think instead of imagining a rather grandiose picture of an ethos that could be created, I think much more in terms of local communities, small groups. And of course, McIntyre thinks a bit like this too.
Yeah.
But I found myself thinking this is really about groups of sufficiently like-minded people who enjoy each other's company,
Mm.
but who don't want to be in a cult.
Mm.
So it's not based on collusion.
Uh,
It's based on actually enjoyable differences, but of course the differences have a limit. And so I think that's where it works for me, which is small groups of people. And I meet people every so often who I feel fall into this group. Not that they're like me, but they have, as far as I can tell, comparable fundamental aspirations or feelings about other people and so on. And I think that's what matters to me. I mean, I went into psychoanalysis because I thought it would have something new to say about the police.
mm.
And I sort of thought, aged 22, that it would be a combination of the Bloomsbury Group and Woodstock.
Mm.
And it turned out to be sort of neither, but a bit of both. And what was most dismaying to me, I was very young then, but what was very dismaying to me was that, I was 14 in 1968, and we knew what was going on in the world. when I went into psychoanalytic training, it was as though the 60s had never happened. I mean, people spoke with immense authority about things. They even spoke with immense authority about the unconscious.
Yeah.
Now, to me, this seemed preposterous. I didn't say this particularly because I just kept quiet and got on with it because I wanted to qualify. But it did seem amazing to me that actually people had gone into it to acquire positions of extreme authority, almost oracular authority. And this seemed to me exactly what it shouldn't be about. It
Yeah.
should be about a world in which there are no experts and there's no inner superiority and people are interested in each other.
Yeah, it's as if there's a secret pact between experts and cults.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
exactly.
both
Yeah,
are concerned with, as it were, getting the words right,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
in the policing sense of
Right
things.
words in the right order.
Right words in the right order. Yeah.
Mm, mm, mm,
So, um, so let me then ask you about this, um, what you called the community, the community, let's say, the improvised community of
mm, mm.
psychoanalysis um, as ethically salient. Um, you know, you say a lot about words in what you write, the importance of new words and new sentences. And I sometimes think of all of modern literature, what we nowadays call creative writing, as words forced to stand without expert or cultish context, forced to stand on their own on the marketplace, you might say.
Mm, mm, mm.
Um, as one symptom of the fate of words in modernity, maybe the most interesting symptom. Let's just
Yeah,
see what happens to words if we send them out into the world.
yeah, yeah,
And you really do this, it seems to me, in your practice, as if um, this might seem like a silly way of saying it, but do you know the game Wordle that's on your
yeah,
phone, right? Where
yeah,
words pop out, or Duolingo, where you have these
yeah.
kind of word games.
Mm.
Um, um, in other words, if you rob words of their expert or cultish context, force them to stand on their own and see what
Mm.
comes of it.
Mm.
That creative writing then, or talking that way, could be an experiment whose implications and possibilities maybe we're just beginning to see in
Yeah,
work like yours. And I wonder whether words spoken to known others or unknown others, left to their own devices to see might be done to see what might be done with them. If you would accept that as a, not a program, but as an apt
yes,
description of what you're up to,
yes, as a way of life. I
Yeah.
think that is what I'm interested in, and that's why when I was young, well, it's still true, but J.L. Austin's Ordinary Language Philosophy and so on, of course, Cavell in a different way. I mean, these people seem to me to be on about that, and there was a period when I would read various philosophers of those who they were the main two,
Mhm.
and when they used the word philosophy, I just replaced it with the word psychoanalysis, if you see what I mean,
Right.
and I learned a lot about psychoanalysis that way round.
Mm.
Because I do think, I think, one of the most interesting things Freud came up with, that wasn't his idea exactly, is the idea of free association.
Mhm.
What happens if you create a setting in which you're encouraged to speak as freely as you're able, and what gets analyzed is where you hesitate, is where there's problem in speaking freely.
Mm.
So I thought, the great thing Ferenczi said, the patient isn't cured through free association. The patient is cured when he can free associate. Now, that for me is like a utopian vision or an appealing vision, when people are, insofar as they're able, free to speak. And Ferenczi also said, why can't we say anything to anybody rather than only to a psychoanalyst?
Mm.
And these seem to me to be very interesting pictures of sociability that
Mm.
are, as it were, undiscovered.
Mm.
What people are capable of thinking and feeling in each other's company and
Mm.
saying.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and one of the biggest obstacles would be the expert context then.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yes,
Uh,
exactly. And those people who are going to have the last word or believe they can conclude the conversation,
mhm, mhm,
when in fact the conversation is open-ended. It has to be.
mhm. Um, yeah, I wonder um, if dialogue is the right model for conversation as we're speaking about it here. In other words, in a dialogue, it's unavoidable, it seems to me, that somebody, whether they want to or not, as it were, gets the last word.
Mm.
And and I wonder if dialogue has dominated our vision of what conversation is, and if this is just I don't know,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
puzzle I have about whether psychoanalysis, in its practice and also in its kind of way of talking about itself, as we're doing here, um, um, breaks the dialogic model somehow.
Yes. Yeah, and I definitely think that. I mean, in the sense of dialogue has become almost fetishized. This is what we should be doing together.
Right.
And it seems to me there are all sorts of other ways of talking. And, one of the interesting things about psychoanalysis is the way it, as it were, disrupts normal dialogue, not entirely, but sometimes,
Mm.
by, say, not answering a question or whatever, or responding in odd ways to each other.
Mm.
So I think that's very, very powerful. I also think that it's a great moment in one of the interviews with Deleuze, where Deleuze says, when someone disagrees with me, I just say, let's just change the subject. And in a way, what that's addressing, I think, is the idea that we should endlessly debate with people who disagree with us.
Yeah.
And, clearly we shouldn't endlessly debate with them. We might occasionally talk with them, but the idea that what we need to do is have really good conversations with the people we hate,
Yeah.
if you see what I mean,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem to be promising. Although I think we should, I think, we live by trading with the enemy. I think that's true, but I think we need a different picture of what we might do together verbally, so to
Mm.
speak, in the exchange of words. We need better pictures of the exchange of words that is not straightforwardly as either profit or loss or dialogue.
Yeah. Or debate about
The
positions.
debate, exactly. Yeah.
Um, Let me ask you from another angle a question about virtue ethics, because I really do think this is um, a super interesting feature of what you're doing, kind of explicitly, and what you say
Mm,
also. One way to ask the question would be to say that, at least as I was taught it, one way of thinking about the tradition of so-called critical theory, since Rousseau, is to say that ethical life somewhere along the lines in modernity began to see itself less as oriented toward a higher good and more as a response to suffering.
mm,
So that what we could really perceive was where things were going wrong, not necessarily where things could go
mm,
right. So that
mm,
ethical life is oriented on this view
mm,
by perception of pain rather than by the virtues or the good.
mm,
And, even those who still speak of human flourishing, again, Jonathan Lear comes to mind, tend to
mm.
see psychoanalysis as promoting human flourishing only insofar as it responds to suffering and
Yeah,
life
yeah,
going wrong,
yeah, yeah,
as if we can only begin to talk about happiness after talking about pain and loss.
yeah,
And the theme in your work, or at least something that gets iterated, as Roland Barthes used to say about themes, is that you don't deny the scale of people's unhappiness, but you nevertheless note that, and I'm quoting you here, we can be so overwhelmed and impressed by people's suffering that we have no imagination left.
mm, mm.
And you've also written, it seems to me, not exactly contrary, but coming at a different angle to Lear's work about how mourning and grief can block rather than promote imaginative power.
Yeah.
Um, in fact, one way mourning might block imaginative power is that our responses to loss become our most sustaining sources of culture and imaginative.
Yes,
There might be
absolutely.
others.
Yeah,
I wonder if
yeah.
that's, am I getting you right there? And
No, no, totally. I mean, one of the first misgivings I had when I began psychoanalytic training
Mm,
was that it was a veil of tears picture, basically.
no.
That sort of life was hell. It was either unbearably conflictual or just simply terrible. And that's where we were starting from. And it's partly a temperamental thing. I don't temperamentally feel like that. I'm not, happy all the time, so to speak, of course, but I'm in good spirits enough.
Mhm.
And that happens to be the way, it is for me. And what I found dispiriting about psychoanalysis was a kind of inability to celebrate people or praise them,
Mm,
which seems to me to be equally, if not more compelling than diagnosing them. In fact, a lot more compelling.
mm,
And so, I always thought that psychoanalysis in determinedly addressing suffering, which is a good thing to do,
mm,
it got addicted to suffering in a way, as though suffering was the currency. That was the only game in town. That was the truth about human beings. Well, it's a very important truth about human beings, but there are a lot of other ones as well. And I think the risk is that it occludes everything else, and that just in straightforward pragmatic practice, in psychoanalysis, it can stop people seeing the best in other people,
mm,
or indeed imagining what the best might be in other people. And this is where virtue ethics, I think, is really interesting,
mm,
which is this is something to do with people's, it seems to me, often genuine wish to be good people, people's genuine wish to be kind and generous. This doesn't seem to me to be an anomaly at all. And people's genuine solidarity with each other. I mean, my understanding of this developmentally is that we begin profoundly identified with other people's pleasures and suffering. And then because it is too much, we then disidentify.
Mm-hmm.
And then we become, as it were, insulated and isolated unduly.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me our capacity to actually identify with and enjoy other people's pleasure is not simply, as Melanie Klein would say, envy or straightforwardly rivalry. We actually can enjoy other people's enjoyment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that seems to me a very, very important thing to promote if you believe it's true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, pleasure, it might be the key word, I think, in your, that would, I mean, if I had to pick one, if you forced me, I
Mm.
would pick pleasure. Um, I love the phrase "unforbidden pleasures."
Me too.
Speaks to what you
Mm.
just said a bit. You know that the idea that pleasure is not simply prompted by prohibition or by envy or by
Yeah.
right, some negative we can find underneath it, mimetic
Mm. Mm.
desire, something like that. Um, but that pleasure is a spontaneous response,
Yes, not just a compensation or a cure for pain.
sensation, and not just as it were having a need satisfied.
Yeah, exactly.
The
Yeah.
the idea that pleasure might be a response to the world beyond the satisfaction of need seems to. And I've never, to be honest
Yeah.
with you, you can clarify better than I can. I've never understood, nor have I found anyone who I felt understood what on earth Freud meant by the pleasure principle. Really,
No, it's completely baffling. The moment you give it a moment's thought, it's baffling.
yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the bafflements to me is that he's it's as if he himself thinks there's some cross current between need satisfaction and, as it were, the fact of pleasure, the
Yeah,
pleasure you take in others' pleasure, as you say,
yeah,
and our
yeah,
own,
yeah,
good food or whatever.
yeah.
Uh,
And he
uh,
often implies that we're sort of blackmailed by pleasure.
mm,
You know, that pleasure is like an alibi. It gives us a reason to do things, as
mhm,
opposed to thinking it might be an end in itself.
mhm,
And that, I mean, certainly I mean, I've very much liked animals and birds when I was growing up. Well, it's quite clear to me, but this may, of course, be me as a projection, that other creatures are capable of, as it were, enjoying themselves in non-need satisfying ways. Or, I mean, you can posit a need, but it doesn't have to justify the pleasure. That there's a certain, as it were, enjoyment in being alive or in one's own vitality or aliveness that is really powerful and non-instrumental
mm,
and
mm,
doesn't require, it's not about profit.
yeah,
It doesn't get me anywhere. It just in and of itself is one of my experiences of being alive.
yeah,
And you feel this, you know, you can be, I don't know if it's true about all people, but you can be feeling a bit sad or low, and then you see, you know, a beautiful flower or a beautiful bird or something, and
mm,
it translates you.
right.
You know,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
wake up and it's a beautiful day and you feel better.
Beauty, certainly the beauty of nature has
Yeah,
often been
yeah,
invoked as the
uh,
as one of the transformative things in that romantic thought.
yeah,
But yours, I mean, you sometimes talk that way, but the text that comes to mind that I think is how can I put this, the most untimely in the Nietzschean sense of the things you've written is the one on kindness that you co-wrote. Um, who talks about kindness? And when it was a virtue back, centuries ago, it
Mm,
was
mm.
simply humanitas. To back
Yeah,
up what you just said, it's
yeah,
as if, the feeling of being humane or being human
yeah,
is what's at stake in kindness. And you really emphasize, I think, wonderfully that the payoff in kindness isn't good things get done in the world or good works or the way it had been framed in the Christian world, but it's a kind of hedonism.
yeah,
Uh,
totally. That's the baffling thing about it. Well, you know, what was baffling in writing the book was realizing how little has been made of this.
right.
When it seems to me everybody, I don't know who everybody is, but everybody experiences the incredible pleasure of people being kind to them and the incredible pleasure of being kind.
Mm,
It's really good. It makes a better world and a better day.
yeah. I mean, do you find there are practices that can attach to? Because what I find difficult in kindness is its institutional shape, so to speak.
Yeah,
Mm.
yes. And then
Uh,
it becomes staged.
yeah, or politeness, or I don't know,
Yeah,
something else.
yeah,
Um, um, I'm just making this up as I'm talking to you, but it seems to me that it's part of what kindness is, part of its pleasure, that it not be institutionally supported.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Or
Um,
dogmatically enforced.
or
You know,
dogmatic.
once it becomes a categorical imperative, then it's something else.
Hmm. Um, so is psychoanalysis, what's its relation to kindness?
Well, yes, I was going to answer your question a minute back and say my wish would be that psychoanalysis, um, it's about enabling people to enjoy each other's company, and it's about enabling people to actually enjoy the pleasures of kindness.
Hmm.
And, you know, and with the initial sense of the word, which is we are of a similar kind.
Hmm. Um, the enabling, can I can I stick with that for a minute? The
Yes.
enabling, I guess, is somehow achieved in talking. Does the talking have to be kind talking?
No, I don't think you have to be kind to facilitate kindness, as though it's contagious. It may be contagious, but I don't think it's instrumental like that. But I think we have all sorts of experiences, some which are kind and some which are unkind, that lead us, or as it were, induct us into wanting to be kind in certain situations.
Mhm, mhm,
It's like that. And in a way, I think you learn it, obviously not, you don't learn it from reading books, although it might help, but you learn it from very fundamental early relationships with people
mm,
and the effects of them. You know, anybody who's had the experience of 5 minutes of good mothering
mm,
knows what the meaning of life is,
mm,
seems to me.
mhm. Yeah, it's very interesting, this idea that kindness is what is enabled by psychoanalysis, but it's not the means.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think it's common to imagine that therapeutic practices must have an element of kindness rather than, as it were, lead to kindness. So I think that,
Yes. Yeah. I think that's right. And the other bit of a certain psychological ethos is you've got to be cruel to be kind.
right, right,
And actually, you've only got to be cruel to be cruel.
right. You've written a bon mot, a Philippsian bon mot, is that psychoanalysis just needs more good sentences, and it's as if that's the means, the
Mm,
means of good
mm,
sentences. You've also talked about this as what would it be to be interested in words, but not necessarily in knowledge or in
mm,
theories.
mm, mm.
Um, as though psychoanalysis were best assessed by what it can do with words, besides promote truth and knowledge.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah.
Um, and this makes me think that it's as if the value of psychoanalysis might be simply aesthetic,
Mm,
or say literary,
mm, mm.
even as it's also ethical, say therapeutic or pragmatic. And then my question really is, well, what's the relationship between these, the literary and the ethical? Is psychoanalysis something that ends up legitimating the literary aesthetic ethically, or vindicating the therapeutic literarily? How do you understand these?
Well,
These?
I think how I understand them is that I think of this as like an ongoing overlapping cultural conversation. So
Mhm,
when you read Freud, you're also reading other modernist writers, if you see what I mean. And obviously there's a prehistory to this. So I've never thought there were two things, literature and psychoanalysis. It seemed to me of a piece, not they're literally the same, but it's kind of a piece, which is finding ways of saying things to find out whether they matter to us
mhm,
and how they make our lives better. And this is why I think pragmatism is really, Rorty's pragmatism is really useful in the sense of the question is, and presumably we've all had this experience, people who like reading, which is you read something, and sometimes you hear something, and it is enlivening, often in ways one can't discern or give an account of. But I know I read Marianne Moore's poems, and I wanted to read all of them. And
mhm,
something about that voice and that syntax and vocabulary and so on had a powerful effect on me. Now, if I was asked to perform my answer to that, I could more or less do it, but it wouldn't quite get it. All I know is that there was something really enigmatically enlivening to me in reading that person or talking to that person. And I think it's a bit like that.
mhm, mhm. In the relationship between, say, studying and teaching literature and practicing psychoanalysis, I mean, just to push a kind of thought experiment,
Mm,
one way of hearing what you just said would be to say, in an ideal world, there'd be no difference. That reading modernist literature, reading Freud, and Milner and thinking about the effects of words on the page on readers and so forth. All of this would be of a piece. And yet, practically, because of I guess, the therapeutic demand of psychoanalysis, no one explicitly says literature class will make you feel better.
Yeah.
Maybe they should, but they don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I wonder if you think, maybe another way to ask the question would be to say,
Mm.
if you think that the institutional difference between psychoanalytic practice and, say, humanities educations in universities is just a kind of bad institutional accident,
Mm.
or if there's really something to that difference, the difference between, say, teaching literature
Yeah. Yeah.
and the therapeutic
Yeah.
value.
I
Is
think both things are true. I think for me, as an adolescent, discovering what was then called literature was like a conversion experience. It really had a powerful effect on me. And then I began to love reading and so on. I then thought, I don't want to be a literary academic, whether or not I could be one. I don't want to be a literary academic because I'd be using the texts to talk to people about their lives in the way that psychoanalysts did and do.
Mhm,
So I suppose in a way, I would like to keep in play the overlap and the difference, because in therapy, obviously, if somebody comes to therapy, there's a shared project. It may evolve, but one is addressing something very specifically personal.
mhm,
Whereas in the study of literature, in my experience, both things are true. One is doing something very personal. There's a reason why one loves the book one likes and so on. But it's addressed in a different kind of language.
mhm,
And it's not addressed with necessarily I mean, in my day, the Leavisite idea was literature made you better at life. It
right,
simply did. It was a good training for living,
right,
as a kind of quasi-religious thing.
mhm,
I don't think that anymore, but I do think for people like us, whoever we are, who like reading, it has a very, very powerful effect.
mhm,
And it's an enlivening effect, and it leads to unpredictable but valued consequences. And I think for me, something similar was true of psychoanalysis, but
mhm,
both the reading of it, but also the doing of it, and the being a patient as well as being an analyst. In
mhm,
that it felt to me like it was intrinsically a valuable part of my life. It made things possible that
mhm,
some which would never have occurred to me.
mhm,
So it was similarly illuminating, but in a more directly personal and conversational way. But for
mhm,
me, it is a continuum.
mhm, mhm. The This gets me back to the experts and the person who says interesting things question.
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
back in the 90s, uh, at least in my mind, famously said, no experts on living in
yeah,
the book on
yeah,
Terror Experts.
yeah, yeah,
And and yet it seems to me that a difference I mean, as you just said, a difference between psychoanalysis and, say, humanities educations in universities, so that when people go to an analyst, when they seek out therapy, they seek out authority.
mm,
In other words, they seek out, the subject supposed to know, to use
yeah,
the
yeah,
Lacanian. And um, where supposed to know means there something very different from the scientific credentialed knowledge
yeah,
of an
yeah, yeah,
that you'll know how to help. Something that, once in a while in office hours, I get the sense that a student wants that from me. But if the
yeah,
conversation goes too far in that direction, we have to stop, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
to send them somewhere else.
yeah,
And, whereas in your case, that's precisely why they come to you.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so there is the expectation of authority of a kind, a helpful authority in psychoanalysis. It seems to me without which it can't proceed
yeah,
therapeutically
sure.
in an interestingly different way to the university.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, the Lacan subject supposed to know, it seems to me it's a bit disingenuous because on the one hand, it's very useful. Clearly, what's being projected into the analyst is a version of the patient's self-knowledge and so on. But also analysts do know something.
Mhm,
If you see what I mean, they can know about development or whatnot. Of course, all these are normative things, but they're nevertheless of interest. And similarly, if I go to I'm glad that my teachers at university knew a lot about literature.
mhm,
If I go to a doctor or I hire an architect, I want them to know what they're talking about. I really do.
mhm,
Obviously, we all do. If you go and see a psychoanalyst, it seems to me slightly different because we do have an authority, but the authority is about two things. One is it's an authority about how people and why people believe in authority.
mhm,
And it's also an authority that is not, we're followers, not leaders, if you see what I mean, as therapists. And so what we know something about is facilitating conversations
mhm,
that are felt to be of value.
Mm.
So we do know things. And if you're a child therapist, you know a lot about child development and all that stuff. But I think we have to have this both ways, which is there's no point in coming to see somebody like me if I don't know anything. And it would be disingenuous for me to say, well, I don't really know anything, etc. Well, I do know things. What I don't know is what it might be like to be you who are coming to see me.
Mhm.
And that will take time to emerge. And it's not as though, and by the end of it, I'll know exactly what it's like to be. Obviously, I won't, but I'll have more of a sense of who you might be, and you might have more of a sense of who you might be and who you want to be.
Mhm.
And that would be the project.
Mhm.
So it's almost, I mean, that's why I think Rorty's useful here. It is the art of redescription,
Mhm.
but redescription in the service of an unknown end.
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, although, I mean, just to kind of, as it were, hit the tennis ball back, that,
Mm,
I mean, I sometimes feel teaching literature seminars
mm,
that the one thing I have to do is facilitate, enable a decent conversation
yeah,
that will, after 15 weeks, be felt by those in the seminar to have been somehow enriching.
yeah,
And what I don't feel I have to do is address the ways in which they bring whatever suffering they bring to the conversation. And in other words, what psychoanalysis seems to, as it were, take on board, maybe more explicitly, is the relationship between the knowledge you have, whatever we want to call that, and suffering, as if there will be something helpful in the way that your conversation with a patient gets at that link between knowledge and
yeah,
suffering that isn't a burden in a literature class. In fact, it's a burden avoided in literature class. I mean,
yes, sure,
right?
yeah,
So,
yeah,
um, um, so if I can press a little on this idea of the relation between knowledge and suffering by by means of Rortian redescription,
mm,
um, um, by which you sometimes seem swayed and sometimes less. The idea that truth is what your contemporaries can let you get
mm,
away with saying.
mm,
Um,
mm.
in order to be efficacious as a response to suffering, um, how true do words have to be in a psychoanalytic setting, in your view? Will any redescription do?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I mean, I know you know this, but the question would be true in what sense? And true might be um, they they're registered, they're felt to be enlivening and of interest.
mm,
They form a kind of haunting, or they enable a thinking. They set something off. So I think they do, in that sense, they need to be. I mean, the alternative to truth here, I think, would be manipulation. I'm finding some way to trick you into changing,
mhm,
as opposed to me saying what I think to be as true and useful as I can, and then, but with a view to you making what you make of it. So it's not the value of what I say, it's what you can make of it that is the value of psychoanalysis. And I think Winnicott's right about this. It's not about making great interpretations, it's about saying things that people can use.
mhm,
And also, just to go back to your beginning of your question, it seems to me one of the powerful things in literary seminars is that you often, and it's poignant too, you do often get a sense of the suffering from which people are speaking. Now, you don't invite them to be explicit about this, but of course, everybody's speaking from their histories.
mm,
And they're interested in this because of their histories and predispositions and so on. So it would seem to me the art of teaching a literature seminar is almost to sort of be a double agent, or have it both ways, in which there's tacit acknowledgement that, of course, people are suffering and enjoying in all sorts of ways, but that's not going to be directly addressed.
mm,
What's going to be addressed is the nature of the text.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And that seems to me a great thing, that it's mediated.
yeah, yeah. It might even be a more honestly therapeutic enterprise. I mean,
Yeah,
in
I agree.
in I mean, I'd love to ask you about this if you don't mind. This might be a good way to move toward wrapping things up. But that, recently, at least in the course of my career, let's say over the last 25 years, um, there's an institutional expectation that some kind of therapeutic um, presence is expanded on campus
Yeah,
and not just in universities, but also in
yeah,
high schools and so forth, counselors and a therapeutic apparatus that is a kind of alternative to what happens in the classroom. And it seems to me that that's an evasion of a really interesting mean, in other words, the fact that those seem to be two different departments in the schools is an evasion of the really interesting impetus behind all of that, which is that students seem to have an inchoate sense that there ought to be something therapeutic, something
Yeah,
in the discussion of the humanities that addresses their suffering. As you say, mediated, not
yeah. But
explicit.
something that will do them good.
It's supposed to do
It
them
will do
good.
them some kind of good.
Yeah. And the idea that we say, I mean, by we, I mean professors say,
Yeah,
well, when the demands are too great, go to the counseling office. That there's a
yeah,
disingenuous move there that
yeah,
we haven't worked out institutionally because we've
yes,
um,
yeah. And the parallel in psychoanalysis is, at what point, when the patient is speaking, do you call the police?
you know,
You see what I mean? It's like that. When at what point do you feel you need another kind of help?
you know,
Because the problem for me about the ethos is the idea that basically we're living in a hospital and everybody's ill,
you know,
and it seems to me a bad picture.
you know,
It seems to me, everybody's making of their lives what they can, and of
you know,
course it's difficult.
you
That's
know,
not all it is. It's one of the things it is, because otherwise we've got a therapeutic community,
mhm,
and everybody's got problems as opposed to preoccupations
mhm,
or
mhm,
difficulties in living, or whatever, however you want to frame it. But I think that we should avoid, insofar as we can, a kind of medical model or a pathologization,
you know,
and just think we're all struggling with this and we're also all enjoying it.
you know, you
And
know,
these options matter.
you know. No, it's a great way of putting it. And the call the police moment or call the hospital moment. How do we hold off the medicalizing
Yeah,
diagnostic
yeah,
solution to
yeah,
difficulties in living?
yeah.
And how can the holding off itself be given some institutional heft?
Yes, exactly. So it feels backed, that it's
Mm,
not just panic or
mm,
impressionism.
yeah, yeah. That's very helpful. This image of calling the police as the alternative, um, because it's the less it can seem an emergency,
Mm.
strangely, the more might be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's about containing anxiety.
Yeah, yeah.